name is Anne Keeney. I think I met most of you. This is our third talk in the series of Voicing Collegiate Recovery. I am the academic lead for this project, and also many of the other members of our leadership team are here, so I'm just going to ask if you would introduce yourself. So, Francis
Fernandez, retired from UCR, where I was a speechwriter, and I'm the chair of the Collegiate Recovery Advisory Board.
And we have one of our student leaders, Fiona.
Hi everyone, my name is Fiona Ryan, and I run some recovery meetings on campus, and I'm part of the leadership team with the band.
And we have one of our co-founders, one of our community partners, who is co-founder of Solid Ground Wellness and Recovery.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lisa Molina. I'm with Solid Ground Wellness and Recovery, and we're a community partner for this project. And I've been in the treatment business for about 29 years.
And our social media intern is here.
I'm also part of the research team, and I'm going to be taking some photos tonight, so if you're not okay with being in a photo, let me know. Thank you.
And then we have our newest addition to our team, who is now our postdoc scholar, Evelyn.
Welcome, Evelyn. Thank you so much for all your support.
Okay, so today the presentation is focused on ethics and stigma in research with vulnerable student populations. And as I said, this is the third talk in our series. In addition to the talks, we also are doing a webinar and podcast series, which we began our webinar and podcast series last month. And we have more information on our website that indicates when any future webinar or podcast series.
The website is
And the website is, again, on the UCR School of Medicine, Center for Healthy Communities, and it is Voicing Collegiate Recovery. So tonight, I also wanted to point out that this series is also supported by Healthy Campus, which really for us is about changing the narrative around students who are here in our campus community with histories from recovering from substance use disorders. So tonight we have our presenter, Dario Kuzmanovic, who is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research Integrity here at UC Riverside, and he will be focusing specifically on research integrity. And I'll hand it over to you.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. So my name is Dario. Thank you very much for coming. Please feel free to eat. I don't mind if you eat at all. And thanks to the organizers for providing all the food. So I'm here to talk to you about research integrity. And I want to make this as interactive as possible and as relevant to you. So feel free to ask any questions. Also, this is kind of an intro or a 101 presentation. So if I use any jargon or anything you don't understand, you can feel free to throw something at me and I will correct that, okay? So what I want to start with first is talk about a bit about what is research. So it's one of those words that, you know, we hear a lot about, but can you give me, what do you think of research as? What is research? What comes to your mind?
Trying to understand something you don't understand.
Good. Okay. Other?
Answering a question.
Answering a question. That's a very good.
new information.
New information. Very good. Anything else?
Proving a thesis.
Proving a thesis. That's a good one. Okay. Okay, so those are all very good, actually excellent definitions. But there is a very prescribed definition that we use in the United States, and we'll cover that just lightly. But I do want to highlight that for you, and why that is important is because that, to a large extent, determines what kind of research U.S. government chooses to regulate. Okay, so keep all these things, the good things you guys have mentioned in mind, but in terms of definition with people, and as far as what's regulated by the United States government, it's actually a very prescribed definition that we have. Okay, so what I want to cover today this is my outline. We talked a bit about what is research. We'll talk about, very broadly, about the so-called scientific method, and you've mentioned some of this here. What is research design? And then the key thing that I want to focus on are IRBs, and what do they do? How many of you have heard the term IRB before? Okay, good. And then probably the most important thing, one of the most important things that IRBs are supposed to be doing is focusing on the informed consent process and informed consent documents. And then I have some topics that I want to highlight specifically as they relate to community engaged research. Now, I do have to, full disclosure, the research regulations and oversight rules are not geared towards any research methodology in particular. So it's not, for example, that they're only covering things to do with community engaged research or research with people who use drugs. They're meant to apply for every discipline, any kind of possible data out there. So again, as long as it falls into that definition that we have. Okay? Are we all on board? Yes? Good? Okay. So this is very good what you guys brought up. So because research by its very own is a kind of a step into the unknown. We don't know something, and we're trying to figure out what this something that we don't know is. Okay? So to start with, it's a step into the unknown. And it is a process of discovering new knowledge, so that was very good. And it's also, in many ways, an attempt to advance current information. So we know something about a topic, but we're trying to gain a better understanding of it. Now, with the definition that I mentioned earlier is this definition here. So a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. That is the definition that we use in the United States for research with people that is under US government oversight. Okay, so.
What does it mean, generalizable knowledge?
Good question. Generalizable knowledge. So the best way to think about that is not knowledge that is only in a small local context, but knowledge that can contribute to more broad interpretations. Okay? So, any questions about this definition? No? Okay. And then this was also very handily brought up, but in terms of how the scientific method works, so we usually start with some kind of an observation about something that we see. Out of that observation, we develop a question. We have something like a hypothesis, which is an estimated guess at the answer to that question. We do something like an experiment, then analyze the data and draw a conclusion. And this is not final, so we don't just draw a conclusion and we're done now, but it is kind of a process that's cyclical and iterative. Now, this is a very cartoonish representation of how the scientific method works. It can be significantly more complicated, it varies by discipline, but this is just, again, like a simple representation, and here's the definition that we use for hypothesis. So, the other thing that I would like to discuss is research design. And the best way to think about research design that I like to think of is kind of like a recipe. Okay, so you design your study to answer a specific question or to address a hypothesis, and then you create your research protocol. So you can think of it also as the glue that holds all the pieces together. Show how they work, what order are things supposed to proceed in, and then these kinds of things are not static, as you can imagine, but they're dependent on the type of question, population, resources, and time, and also the discipline where the researcher comes from. Okay? All right. So, the history of research ethics is, we could spend hours and hours talking about all of these cases. But there are some cases that are quite infamous and that have done a lot to shape how we currently interpret research ethics regulation and why we have such a stringent system of oversight for research with people. Okay, so how many of you have heard of the Nazi experiments? Okay, large majority. And then the Tuskegee syphilis study. Okay, the Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. Not a lot of people, a few. Okay, and the Facebook study in 2014. 2, 3. Okay. So these cases have all done. They've been very, very famous, most of them. And as you can see, that they have kind of progressed most of last century and continue to happen even today with companies like Facebook. Okay. The two that I want to highlight for you here are the Nazi experiments. So they happened during World War II, quite horrific studies. And what happened at the end of this, the defense of all the German doctors was there are no rules for research with people. Okay. So what happened after the Nazi experiments, we get something called the Nuremberg Code. How many of you have heard of this? A few. Okay. So Nuremberg Code is the first major set of international research ethics guidelines. And it sets out 10 principles for doing research with people. Now, it is an international guideline document, so it doesn't really have any legal weight behind it, but it does become crucial in informing everything that comes after it, including the development of research ethics regulations in the States. The case that has probably done the most to inform US regulatory oversight is actually this study here, which is the Tuskegee syphilis study that happened in Macon County, Alabama in the United States. Oftentimes people call this the Tuskegee study. I don't like that name because it seems like it happened in like this one region and it was, just there. This was a study that was funded by the US government for 40 years approximately. Okay, so this was not a study that was just happening somewhere locally that someone went away. This is multiple generations of people doing research on African American men in rural parts of Alabama. Now, when the study itself started, there was no good treatment for syphilis. So in the beginning, the justification for the study was, we're trying to figure out how to treat syphilis. Around 1950s, penicillin becomes widely available. However, as you can see, the study continues for 20 plus years after that. And then it wasn't until a whistleblower brought this to the attention that this kind of created a huge uproar in the 1970s. So what happens then is there's this report that's published saying, we need oversight of research with people in the United States because there was nothing at the federal level. So we get a set of regulations for the United States, and they are largely informed by the PHS Tuskegee syphilis study. Okay? Any questions about this study or anything we've covered here? Yeah.
Can you just mention briefly the Facebook study?
Sure. So the Facebook study is a kind of a interesting one because what happened was, so what Facebook did is basically a simple, what we call a two-arm design. Okay. So in one arm, in the news feed. So they randomly assigned people. I believe the study actually took place in 2012, but they published it in 2014. In one arm of the study, they withheld positive status updates. Okay? So if you said, I got a new cat today, and you were in this arm, your friends would not be able to see that you posted that. Okay? In the other arm, they did the opposite. Okay, so if you were in the other arm, they would push up the negative content. Okay, so one was positive, one was negative. And then they just watched for what did people post. Was it a more negative post or a positive post based on the arm of the study they were in? So the study was, if you were on Facebook in 2012, you were part of the study, so congratulations, in case you didn't know. But the study was received quite negatively. But since then, Facebook has had several other negative things that have hit the media. But the study was not well received, and Facebook changed, as a result, has changed a lot of its practices. So you can actually now look up on Facebook's website, or on Facebook, you can see that they have a research page where they try to be more proactive. They still don't do things like obtain individual consent, but a lot of the stuff that they do now focuses on, how big of an icon do you want, or how frequently should you put up an ad and something like that. So they're trying to move away from stuff that got them into trouble in 2014. So.
Assuming they didn't inform anybody.
No, absolutely not. Well, they put it in the terms of service, which everyone reads very diligently. Yeah, in that small legalese font. Yeah.
Just curious, what did they find? Like, what were they looking for?
So what they found was there was a small effect size. They were trying to see whether positive or negative posts are more likely to make people feel more likely to post something positive or negative. They did find that there was a small effect size on this. So I heard the guy, they partnered up with a researcher from Cornell, and I heard the guy speak at a conference. He got a lot of hate mail. He got a lot of, very angry emails from people after the study became public. Subsequently, he then left Cornell and went to work for Facebook, by the way. So one of the things that was, and that my friends who are psychologists say, there's no way to know whether being in the arm where the negative content was promoted, if there were people who were at risk of being depressed or perhaps even suicidal, there's no way of knowing whether something like this would push them over the edge. Facebook will say, no, that can't happen. But again, there is a small effect size, right? And you cannot see, some people come to Facebook for different reasons. Some turn to it, for support and for people to, engage with, family members and so on. But the most striking email that this researcher shared was, there was a woman who emailed him and saying, I can't believe you did this because I didn't see that my friend's mother had died as a result of having been in the study. So again, it was, I don't think this was well thought out. Yeah.
I'm astounded that somebody from Cornell would be involved. Don't they?
Yeah.
Somebody like you there?
They do have some, so again, I am overly simplifying how all of this works. I'm just going to say that for the purposes of this discussion, not everything gets reviewed. There are things that don't get reviewed, and given that researcher's involvement, Cornell didn't have to review it, so legally. Okay, so that's kind of how they bypassed this, because all the data was collected on Facebook, and they just provided him with de-identified data, and he helped analyze it. So, okay. Other questions? All right. So, we talked about some of the reasons why we have now this kind of system of oversight and all these rules regarding regarding research involving people. But I would say that history is there are blogs out there where people just post controversial or problematic, infamous cases of research on people. But I actually don't think that's one of the most compelling reasons to have a system of oversight. A lot of research, because of this issue we discussed earlier, being a step into the unknown or trying to figure out something that we didn't know before, carries some risk of harm. Okay, so there are some studies that are virtually no risk, but there is some small risk of harm. Also, science is getting more and more complicated, and an average person may not have the capacity to understand what a very complicated study is trying to accomplish. So one of the reasons why we have created, or why we have these kind of research regulations in the United States, is to try to help to simplify some of this. Scientists and researchers spend a lot of time in their labs and offices, and they can sometimes write consent documents or kind of protocols that are not very easy to digest or understand. So one of the reasons why we have this kind of oversight system is that it's meant to act as a kind of a buffer, you can think about it, to try to simplify this and ensure that there are no unnecessary risk, or that people are understanding what they're signing up for when they go to participate in a study. We always run the risk of exploiting people, and to ensure that we're not, doing research on one community, but only providing benefits to another community. This is especially relevant when we talk about research in other parts of the world, where, very resource-poor settings. But I would say that the main reason why we have this kind of a system of oversight is that for public institutions like University of California, we are dependent on public trust. And if we lose this public trust, we would not be able to do research. And cases that we discussed earlier, like the Facebook study and so on, the PHS syphilis study, they erode public trust in science and researchers and the research process and the scientific method. And also, for most researchers and professionals, it's part of their professional ethics that they should adhere to these kinds of practices. Okay, so now I want to talk to you a bit about IRBs. So IRB stands for Institutional Review Board. Every institution that is research intensive will have something like an IRB, and sure enough, here we have 2 IRBs at UCR. And they are charged with reviewing and approving research proposals that involve the faculty members here, or students or staff, as kind of again, like the name says, an independent group of people who are not part of the research study. Okay? Again, required for all UC students and all the faculty. On these committees, we almost always have something like a community member, and then we also have one person who's considered a non-scientist. And again, they're meant to act as like a check, or to ensure that because the other people on the board are all affiliated with the institution, they're not just, approving everything that comes ahead because they want to, get more research funding and get more research dollars and so on. Questions about IRBs?
Like you have 2 IRBs.
Yes. We have 2 IRBs because of this building that we're in, partially, which is we have Social Sciences IRB, which reviews things from, the humanities, social sciences, and so on. And then we have one which reviews things that are more biomedical in nature. And that's very common at a place like UCLA. They probably have 6 IRBs because of all the hospitals they have and so on. It's also a matter of workload volume. This is difficult work, and it takes a long time to review. And sometimes this frustrates community members or researchers who are waiting for approval from an IRB, but the process does take a bit because it is, again, very labor intensive. Other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh.
And consent isn't really something I can get from them, from their parents, and from their orphans. So what kind of steps do you
So the question is, if everyone, when you're working with children, how do we deal with consent? Let's just put a pause on that, and it's coming up, but very good question. Anything else? Yeah.
So if someone's a community member on an IRB board and the rest of the board is like UCR faculty or
Mhm.
something, is it a majority vote type of thing whether something gets approved? Because like what if, all the faculty wants to push it through for those research dollars and that one community member is like, no,
Yeah.
then what happens?
So just because of the size of our board, we have more than one community person on the board. And I can tell you, and if you talk to the researchers here, the UCR faculty members, it's primarily made up of faculty members, that's not the attitude they have. As a matter of fact, researchers often complain that the boards are too, what would we say? Stringent? Yeah, strict. They send a lot of comments. It's a lot for them to address. And they have a lot of work to do, and it takes them a while to respond to the board. So in practice, it operates very differently. But it is a good question. It is majority rule, though, at the end of the day. However, if we saw, there's a chair of the IRB, of course, always. If we saw that there was all the community members were saying no, and the faculty were all saying yes for reasons that you mentioned, that would raise a lot of red flags. So, yeah.
Is participation on this board volunteer-based, or is there, like, do the members of the board get a stipend? Because I feel like the difference is there, like, would that have any effect?
Mhm.
Having a stipend or not, would that have an effect on, how fast
Yeah.
you want to, like, get it over with? Right?
Yeah.
Is that just not the attitude?
Not the attitude at all, but they do not get compensated to serve on this board at all. And that is not, there's nothing against them being compensated of being on these boards, because sometimes these meetings can run a really long time, but they do not get compensated. We don't even give them food like this, so, yeah. Other questions? Okay. So again, researchers, the IRBs ensure that researchers is following the federal regulations that we talked about earlier that came out because of that PHS study. We also have, as a public institution, we have a lot of as a UC, we have a lot of rules and regulations that the UC system follows. And then we also have state regulations. I moved to California in 2015, and California just loves to add additional rules and regulations at the state level. And then again, there are professional ethical guidelines that researchers have to follow in their disciplines. Now, the way this works is, in practice, a researcher will propose a research project and then submit that project to the IRB for review. It could be either, but just for purposes of tonight, we'll say it's before the funding. Okay. Researchers may not begin their research project until they have the approval from the IRB. Now, that works for what we call a new study. So you submit a new study that you want to do, but it also works if you want to change your study, which researchers often do. This is the part that can sometimes get frustrating. It can take anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks to gain an approval from an IRB, depending on the complexity of what is being proposed. That is a long time. For those of you working on community-based participatory projects, a lot of frustration can happen sometimes because there'll be a community advisory board meeting, and the community members will come up with all sorts of great, lovely ideas for, let's say, a meeting that's happening in 10 days. And then they'll go to the principal investigator and say, hey, we should do all these things, okay? And then the principal investigator will say, well, sure, but we need to get approval from the IRB, and they're currently taking 4 weeks to approve something. there are some things that we can do to try to address this, but this can sometimes be frustrating. So I'm not sure whether there have been experiences like this, or have we managed this?
So in our project,
Remember it going through it.
it went through IRB and it actually went to the full board review. And we haven't had any amendments. So we had a lot of really great feedback from members of the IRB and things that we had to change. And since then, we actually haven't, basically, it's a blueprint and we've been following it.
Okay, that's good. A recipe, yeah.
It was actually a very interesting experience. I hadn't been through that before, and I was impressed by how carefully they had thought about stuff.
Yes, yeah. So one of the things, for those of you working with community-based participatory projects, IRBs are not used to that kind of a research methodology. Okay, so that is something new to them. I actually moved here from Canada, and community-based participatory research is huge there. So IRBs are a lot more accustomed to reviewing these kinds of projects. Kind of the stereotypical IRB project is, someone in the School of Medicine is testing a drug of some sort, and people take that drug to see whether, let's say, it improves their migraines. Okay, that's kind of the stereotypical. But when you start talking about community-based participatory research, where people from the community may participate as part of the research design, or may conduct interviews, or even help with the analysis of data, it throws IRBs for a bit of a loop, because they're just not used to seeing things this way. So we've really tried to work very closely with Center for Healthy Communities here to get the boards, to get the IRB to start getting familiar with this kind of approach to research. And sometimes we can hit some glitches too, right? Because they're just not used to seeing things this way. Because in a stereotypical IRB study, the person doing the analysis would never be from the community, because you try to keep those things as separate as possible. Okay?
Why is it so common sorry, Pam. Why is it so common in Canada?
So the reason was because there was just a push at the federal, one of the funders had a huge push and focus on community-based participatory research, and then just kind of funded a lot of these studies. And in the beginning, it was very difficult, and boards were rejecting it, because saying, no, you're breaking confidentiality because people are looking at the data, and that can't happen. But eventually, this kind of was smoothed out. Yeah.
I think that answered my question partially to who cares, who analyzes or interviews people. Is that really influential on the study? Is that a trust issue that we're facing? And maybe that's why Canada is
Yeah.
ahead of us?
No, so I would say that it's actually more, so it is not, I don't think it's a problem in terms of who analyzes data. However, it is a problem if we have a breach in confidentiality. And there are some things that are unique to community-based participatory research that would almost never happen in the traditional research design. So do you want to talk about some of the things that are?
Yeah, so let me just see. So for instance, Fiona is a student and she's part of our leadership team. And while right now this is engagement, we will in the spring collect data. And Fiona, if she chooses to, she can choose to be trained to be able to collect the data and analyze the data. But she is a member of the same student community and other stakeholders who will also be engaging in the research. So it raises issues of, we need to make sure Fiona understands, and any other individual who's part of the data collection and analysis, that they can't share this information, they can't identify the individuals involved in the research, because we want to make sure to maintain the confidentiality and the anonymity. And so you could say in more traditional models of research, that the researchers aren't necessarily part of the community.
No.
And so that there's a greater distance and separation between the researcher and the community.
Yes.
Whereas in community-based participatory research, it's very different. Members of the community are part of the research team, and the collection and analysis of data.
There'll be an overlap of roles.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the criticisms of traditional research has been that people who are doing the research are so abstracted from the community they're researching in. So, you can imagine it's usually a white male in a lab coat who comes in, takes samples, and goes to a lab, analyzes them, publishes a paper, and that's almost all that. So that was one of the criticisms that CBPR is meant to address. But we have, come into a situation where we have there are different issues to consider, and I'm not saying these are not, you can't breach these, but confidentiality in research is one of those kind of bedrock principles. And if you are a member of a community who is then also part of, let's say, a team that you're helping recruit or perhaps interview people as a part of the research design. If you're just a member of the community, you can talk about and say, maybe it's in poor taste. You can talk about and say, oh, I saw Jane and she was doing this or that. But now if you're a representative of the study, that becomes a breach of protocol and you're breaking confidentiality. So it is a slightly different issue than just a community member talking about someone. Have I convinced you or no?
So if I can, if part of our community, and if she's interviewing other students who also are in recovery, and then she sees Joe Blow over there and says, oh, I was interviewing her, and you have no idea what she got up to when she was drinking.
Yeah.
You understand?
Yeah,
But you can't do that.
wouldn't that come out in the research anyways?
Well,
Not-
you
not
wouldn't
by name.
identify the
Not by name.
You
Yeah.
wouldn't,
Yeah.
It's all de-identified
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
protect anonymity.
Yeah.
So that's really what it is all about.
Yes, it's about.
I mean, there are other issues, but this is one example of an issue that is unique. Yeah.
So I think I can make this a little bit more concrete. So I didn't announce this in the beginning, but there are pictures or images, photos up around, and this is from our original Photo Voice project. So if you take a look, these are images from participants in our study. This is the study that really drove the research that we currently, or the work that we're currently doing through our Corey grant. And you wouldn't know who these individuals are, but there's 17 individuals who were UCR at the time. They were UCR students. It included undergraduate students, graduate students, and medical students. But we don't know who they are. Their words are also attached in some cases to their photos. So they use photography to be able to explicate or explain their experience of being in recovery here on our campus, and also to share what it is that they needed for recovery support.
So when the IRB reviewed that project, that was a huge concern for them, right? So they did, for example, that one right there, the IRB made a lot of comments and right that faces should not be identifiable, right? And sometimes faces are not identifiable, but if I always wear this one scarf and then I'm the only person on campus who has this unique scarf, that is considered an identifier. So the board really wanted assurances that this would not be clear. And you may not think of this if you are not operating in this kind of a world of research and how important it is to protect confidentiality.
So can I add?
Yeah.
That's a really important point. So there are a few pictures that you can see faces. And what happened, we were originally not approved for students to take any pictures that would identify themselves or others. And then students came back to us during the interviews when we discussed their photos, and they said, I wanted to take a picture of myself. I really wanted to take a picture and to share that. And so we then went back to the IRB. We had an amendment. We provided the evidence from the students saying that they really wanted to have the opportunity to share an image of their own face or something that would allow them to be identified. And we did get approval, but we also at the same time shared with students, we really explained to them, they had to sign also a media release form or a photo release form, so they understood that when they gave these photos to us, that it was part of research and that we would be publishing this, we would be sharing it, that other people in the community would have access to these images, and that they needed to be informed about that to make a decision.
Good questions. Anything else? Yeah.
My question is outside of what we've been talking about.
Okay.
How many, on an annual basis, how many research studies are going on
Yeah.
on average?
So,
These two?
yeah. So on just this side, in my office, there are 7 committees like the IRB, but they look at different things. This is on research with people. With between these 2 IRBs, we have around 1,200 active projects currently. Oh, that's nothing. UCLA has around 6,000. Yeah, it is quite, and it is because of all these regulations that you have here, it is there's a lot of documentation that they're required to do. So, yeah. Sure.
Because this has to be with federal, and you mentioned also sometimes state and then institutional ethical guidelines, are there specific forms that everyone who submits has to submit, or it's just
No.
it varies?
It varies. So each IRB in each institution will have its own questions. There are some things that they have to cover, but the way they ask it, it can be different. So we have people here who've come from different institutions, and they'll say, "Whoa, you ask way more questions here," or they don't. On my previous institution, they didn't ask any questions. So it really varies. There's some minimum that they all have to do. But for example, think about it also this way, because of what I mentioned at the state level in California, there are some things that you would just have to do in the state of California, for example. Other questions? Okay. So the other things that IRBs do is, if there are complaints from people who participated in a study, and if you, as a participant, feel you can't resolve it with the researcher, okay, you can submit a complaint to the IRB. Okay, so I'll get back to that in a sec. But first I wanted to talk about the informed consent process, and now we actually come back to your question. So IRBs obsess about informed consent documents. Okay, so the majority of the comments that they'll send is about this document called the informed consent document that most studies are required to have. Your studies have informed consent, right? So sometimes the informed consent does not have to be a document. It can be a process. The IRB can choose to waive it for valid reasons. So for example, in some instances where there's stigma, or even there could be criminality associated with a research activity, okay, the IRB can waive the requirement for informed consent. So it can it can waive the requirement for a signed informed consent. So in this case, it would only be a verbal informed consent. So for example, if you work with people who are undocumented, who may engage in some activities like sex work, this is multiple layers of vulnerability. The researcher can apply to an IRB to not collect identifiers, because those could be subpoenaed, and then those people could be legal harm as well as criminal charges and so on.
But presumably, the consent would have to be witnessed, otherwise the researcher could just invent it.
So, correct. So, IRBs don't concern themselves too much with that. The informed consent process does not have to be witnessed. That is not a federal requirement. However, it is often a practice because of the reasons that you mentioned, which is you don't want someone to fabricate people having participated in the study. Okay, but IRBs don't usually think about that. IRBs can actually always have the power to observe the informed consent process. They can say, we want to see how you consent people into the study. That is a possibility. The overwhelming majority of them do not do that because of just bandwidth. The capacity is not there. So again, informed consent process, hugely important. I get often questions about, how long should my informed consent document be? There is no answer to this question. The best way I can describe this to you is you should think about it if you were enrolling a loved one into the study, what would you want them to know? Okay. There are informed consent documents that are less than a page or half a page, and there are informed consent documents that are 40, 50 pages long. Okay. So if you've ever participated in those studies that you see advertised, make $4,000 for 1 week of participation in a study, those studies usually will have very thick and dense informed consent documents. They're not easy to read at all, but they do this to protect themselves because these are new drugs that are being tested. Okay? One of the most challenging things is that people who, that this qualifies for students as well as for faculty members, they write at a very high level. The average person in the United States reads at a grade 8 reading level. Now, we could have a whole discussion about that, but let's just assume grade 8 reading level is actually a very difficult level to write at. The sentences are difficult to write in such a simple format when you're trying to convey very complicated ideas. Okay. Questions? You were a speechwriter. Are you disagreeing with the?
No,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that journalists are trained to write to that level in this country.
I see.
The delight in England of reading the Sunday paper is you need a dictionary. But you're not supposed to do that here.
Yeah. But scientists and PhD students are notorious for, because they read this stuff that's very dense, and if they write. Then they'll write that in an informed consent document, and the IRB will send them a lot of comments about having to clean up the document. Okay, so participants must have the capacity to understand what they're consenting to. Now, this is not an absolute rule. There are exceptions to this. But the key thing is that voluntary choice be emphasized, and that for the question you asked about children, they cannot consent to a research study, but they can provide assent. So assent would be that their parents consent for them to participate in a study, but then the researcher also asks the child, in this case, whether they would want to participate in the study. And they would ask these questions at a level that is comprehensive to whatever the age that children are. Does that answer your question about?
If they're orphans, then who gives the consent?
So, if they have would they have a guardian of any kind?
I would assume so.
So,
My project is a little bit complicated in that sense because I'm studying hospital detention policy in Nairobi. So a lot of them are in the care of the hospital, and they actively deny that they're kept there. So I'm negotiating between liminal spaces of consent, and it's not always possible. Some of them have parents, some of them were born there and left there.
yeah. So when we talk about this is a practice that we use here in the States, but usually we would defer to the researcher to find the best solution to the other country. But usually someone has to provide consent who's some kind of a legal guardian, or if in these cases sometimes there's like an administrator who can provide consent for people to participate in a study. Now, it also depends on what the study is. If it's just talking to someone about their experience, and the risk is low, there is more flexibility than if it's like a very, you're talking about things that could be very traumatic, or you're, doing invasive things like drawing blood and, inserting things into people and so on. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So you can imagine that on an average IRB meeting, they'll be reviewing a study like the one that Anne did, which is recovery and so on. And then the next minute they're reviewing a study about sex workers in Thailand. And then they go to a study, homeless youth in LA. They mostly lean on the researcher to provide the justification about what they're trying to do. They will ask questions about risks, and they may ask you, you're asking all these questions. Do you have to ask this many questions about something to gain the answer that you're trying to gain? Or can you, maybe ask 2 questions as opposed to 10? So they can push you to justify things like that. But because you are the expert in that area, they will often lean on you to provide the justification and the explanation of the questions you're trying to ask. We usually want there to be a full disclosure of research purposes, what will happen, risks and benefit, and anything else that may be relevant. So this is something that the regulations are specific on. They do want there to be, they call it the reasonable person standard. What would a reasonable person want to know? You cannot, let's say that it's a student doing a project, you cannot provide them your literature review of all that you've done on the topic. That's just not feasible. But you do need to provide something that what they call a reasonable person would want to know before participating in that study. Now that can be frustrating because people vary in terms of what they want, but it is a standard that we have to kind of try to approximate or reach. So this is, here again, a caricature of what an informed consent document usually looks like and what are the headings. So you have your title, who's on the study, some kind of an intro or background. You disclose if you have any conflict of interests. Not so much for the research that we talk about here. This is usually in the School of Medicine again, where you may have investments in a drug you're trying to research, so we'll just put that aside. But anyway, these are the other sections that you have in an informed consent document. Which one do you think my office gets most calls about? Confidentiality, okay. Sorry? Conflict of interest? Risks and benefits, that one. Compensation? It's compensation. Yeah. The number one thing that people call us about is compensation. And honestly, I don't even think it's about the money, because compensation in studies is, minimal at best. If there is, it's completely fine not to have compensation in a study, by the way. But it's something that researchers do to try to, respect people's time. But what people get annoyed with is if you say you will get $10 for participating for an hour, and they end up being there for an hour and a half. So that's what they get really annoyed about, because they say, you told me an hour, I made accommodations, and you kept me here for, 2 hours or hour and a half, and they'll call us. And if you don't have something in your informed consent document, we side with the participants, because it is reasonable. If you said, I'm going to only keep you here for an hour, that they only be kept for an hour. So cut down your interview. Okay. Or pay them more, yeah. Or explain it in informed consent, saying it will take approximately an hour, but could be, yeah. Okay. So IRBs have certain criteria that they need to meet for approval. I've here provided a grade, I would say, 8 or 9 interpretation of it. It's written in a very complicated way in the federal regulations. But the study has to be designed well. There should be not any unnecessary risks. This doesn't mean that there are no risks in a study. We talked about some of these studies where people are, taking a drug for the first time. And before those people took a drug, it was only tested in mice, right? So we don't know what's going to happen. We can guess, but we don't know what's going to happen when people take this drug, right? Risks are reasonable. The selection of participants in the study is equitable. informed consent is obtained and documented. So that's something that you mentioned. And then privacy and confidentiality measures are in place to protect the confidentiality of the participants. Okay, so here I just have a couple of more slides. Are we at time?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I have a couple, I'll share these slides, but I had just a couple more things about things that are unique to CBPR, but we will not cover this now. I'll just skip to my last slide, which is on our website, you can find a bunch of more resources. So we actually have a page here. You'll be able to click on this when I send the slides to Anne. But we have a page that's geared towards research participants. I can tell you more about, as a layperson, what you need to know about your rights and what you can do and when do you involve an IRB and how all of that works. Also, talking about CBPR, I was actually project lead for a study that looked at some of the ethical issues that happen with people who use drugs and when they participate in community-based participatory research. So you can actually go on that website and see we created a resource for people written at a grade 6 level. And that was very difficult to write. Like grade 6 was just very, very difficult. So that's something you can look at. And then for all people who are in a study, they can use our city training on research. Yes, all of you have had to do this. So, yeah. All right, any questions? Okay, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So thank you for coming. I do want to emphasize that all of our leadership team members have taken city training. And that we have a survey. It is not research. It is only on your thoughts about this presentation. This is feedback for us in the future. And if you have any questions for myself or for Dario or any other member of the Corey team, please ask.
Well administered, for someone like me, took the little bus to school. No, don't make a deal. No, so that was really good. But what did you want us to walk away with? What was the purpose
Great
of
question.
this for, people like me?
Right. So that's a really great question. I know you've been here part of the other talks, and what we are doing is building capacity. So we really want people who
What do you mean by building capacity?
So building people's abilities to know
understand.
and understand research. Do you want to respond?
I think I just did. Yeah, we want people to understand what's involved in research. So if they want their organization to take part, which is what we would like, then they know what's involved. They know what to expect. And also to allow them to identify procedures in their workplace with people in recovery or not in recovery, as the case may be, to see what would be suitable for research.
Yeah. And I'll just add to what Francis said. So this work that we're doing is over 2 years. We're in the engagement phase of our Voicing Collegiate Recovery project. And at the end, the funders expect that we provide them with essentially an agenda of future research. And we know that we want to engage different stakeholders. And when I say that, it means students who are in recovery, providers, so campus and community members who are interested in being in part of the decision making about what kinds of research we will do moving forward. And so given that research integrity, institutional review board is a part of what we will be doing in community-based participatory research, it's really important that we start engaging people so that when we say, oh, well, we've got to fill out the IRB, you need to complete that protocol, or you're going to have to take the city training, that you have an understanding of what that means and why we're doing it.
Copy that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I guess on my part, the other I want to highlight is sometimes, again, having worked on community advisory boards and having done some of the research myself, it is sometimes very frustrating to community members when they say, hey, we have an event next week and we want to do this, but then we would have, we have to go to the IRB, and well, who the hell is the IRB? Why are they taking so long? It's just a simple amendment we're doing. Why? So that has, I hope that one of the things that you walk away is that, researchers like Anne have a lot of rules and regulations that they have to follow, being part of a system like UC, and IRB is one of those key ones because some of these historical issues that we talked about.
Any other questions? Okay, make sure to fill out the survey, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks.